great pleasure to welcome Sara de Jong at Loughborough. Sara is a former collaborator, old friend of mine, and Sara also advised us in the early stages of our University of Sanctuary application, because she was one of the people who were crucially involved in York University application to become a University of Sanctuary. What I'm always very impressed by with Sara's work is on one hand her theoretical rigor and her excellent scholarship. So Sara has worked on a range of different topics on politics of NGOs and civil societies. She also publishes more conceptual work on post-colonialism and decolonial theory, race and racism. She's worked on brokers and conflict and migration, and questions of cooptation of radical politics. And her first monograph was called Complicit Sisters, Gender and Women's Issues Across North-South Divides, published with the University of Oxford Press. So that was one of the works in this area. So she is very active research-wise, but also very committed to making a difference with her research, and is one of the co-founders of the Solia Alliance, an advocacy organization. Her recent work has focused on Afghan interpreters, the rights of Afghan interpreters, and the protection of, or lack of protection of, Afghan interpreters. And this is an advocacy organization that came out of that. And Sara has also worked with artists, with other organizations to try to bring awareness to the issue. Has done a lot of work with the media, has been to Parliament to make a difference. I don't know, she's going to tell us more about that work. So this is work that you have been doing for over eight years now. So a big commitment and a really dense body of work, and we're very excited to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Lena. Camilla, I felt flattered and happy about the invitation, but also challenged, because of course we have a very diverse audience here in terms of disciplinary backgrounds, but I think also people who are activists or practitioners in the space, people who identify primarily as academics. And so that's quite a lot to cover, and I feel a very strong affinity with all of those strands, but I'm not sure, of course, that I can do justice to all of those things. Camilla, of course, did the work of introducing some of the topics of today, and I will certainly come back to some, including complicity, something I'm really interested in. I guess, so I'm based in the Department of Politics and International Relations, but I guess I have tried to make this a presentation that speaks both to social science and the humanities audience. I was trained in critical theory, and as Lena said, I've worked with a lot of artists previously. So I have a very close attachment also to that work, and I think it shouldn't be separated by disciplinary boundaries, but we find ourselves in institutions, of course, that sometimes do separate us. I thought it would be helpful to kind of anchor my presentation in this slogan, "We are here because you were there," and kind of use that as a way to think through different ways of our relationships to a politics of displacement. It is a slogan that some of you might know, which was used by post-colonial migrants from the Caribbean in the UK. So, of course, after the Second World War, when people, for instance, from the Windrush generation were recruited to the UK to fill labor shortages, many people are still asking the question, where these people suddenly came from. And of course, the answer of those post-colonial migrants was, we are here because you were there, you colonized our country, so surprise, surprise. And you invited us to join your armies, set up the NHS, so that is why we're here. And I always thought that this slogan extends, of course, much beyond that very particular moment in history and very particular group. And so even though, again, my presentation is anchored in my own research, I'm hoping that by anchoring it in this slogan, we can collectively think together, because I know that some of you, your politics, as Malcolm also said, maybe with everybody who's displaced, but some of you might still have more practical affinity, perhaps with particular communities, particular type of resettlement schemes, etc. So we are here because you were there. Was also the name of an exhibition that I eventually made with a photographer called Andy Barnum. He himself is an Afghanistan veteran who reached out to the Sula Alliance, the kind of advocacy initiative that I had started together with some other military veterans who had been my research participants. And in 2021, he reached out when Kabul fell, asking if there was any way he could help, because he realized, of course, that sometimes pictures speak louder than words. And at the time, we were very overwhelmed with just working kind of with people who are still left in Afghanistan. So we were kind of batting away most of the offers for help and support. But I agreed, he was quite insistent, so I agreed to meet with him. And I found him very interesting because he was a veteran, but he was actually trained as a Farsi linguist. So he could, while he was on his mission, communicate with local people. And so he identified very closely, of course, with Afghan civilian interpreters who were also in that interpreting role. And then the other thing that struck me about Andy immediately was that I come, as Lena already said, from a post-colonial perspective. And Andy himself, his mother is Vietnamese Chinese, and her family had to be evacuated from Saigon when the Americans left Vietnam. And so he also had this kind of personal story, a family story of displacement that meant that he could really understand in a different way what the kind of continuities were between those historical occurrences and contemporary ones. Some of you who may be working on Ukraine might also be fascinated by the reference to Ukraine at the back of the image, and I will come back to that at the end of the presentation. It was kind of serendipitous, but I think it's really interesting that the posters are side by side. So this is a poster in Cardiff that is advertising our exhibition, as it was called. We are here because we were there. These are portraits of Afghan interpreters that Andy took, and because although these people were now in the UK, they were still very concerned about the safety of their family members in Afghanistan. As you can imagine, they didn't want their faces to be recognizable and shown. So these are 10 portraits put on top of each other with layers, each of the 10 layers blurred or pixelated in different parts, as a way to present an image that is still a portrait and that still creates a human face that we as audience members need to respond to, while at the same time, protecting their identity. And I'll show a little bit more of it later, but when we present this in spaces where we exhibit, sometimes more formal galleries, sometimes, refugee week dinners, like very different settings, we always position them at eye height so that people have to look somebody in the eye. And they are always hanging next to a quote from the interviews, and there are 14 portraits together that tell an individual but also a collective story. As you will later see, the quotes are in different fonts, small and large, and again, it means that you see something from far away that might strike you. No other option, for instance, but you would have to come and lean in further to be able to see this kind of smaller print, which means, again, you have to engage more closely with the person who has said this certain thing. So that's a little bit of the context. So just so that you have a little bit of background, the research basically looked at spaces of contention around Afghan and also initially Iraqi interpreters who had worked for Western forces. And I basically looked at everywhere where Afghans and Iraqis were managing to make their voices heard, whether this was because they were protesting or because they set up self-organizations, communities, self-help groups, or because they were managing to litigate against the state or getting their voice out in the media. I followed that. So it wasn't concentrated on one country. As you know, the NATO mission was international. It was basically focusing on where there was noise. And I would go to those places and interview both the Afghans as well as the advocates that perhaps worked alongside them to make sense of how they managed to make their voices heard. I started in 2017 when, as you can imagine, this was a very niche topic. Nobody was really interested in Afghan interpreters and their claims to rights and protection, but also before the fall of Kabul in 2021, they were already very much at risk. They are seen as kind of traitor translators, the eyes and the ears of the Western invaders. And so for the Taliban, there are explicit targets, both for their symbolic representation of the invasion and the notion of treachery, you know, that they're attaching themselves to the invaders, as well as, of course, very practically, interpreters interpreted, for instance, the communication by the Taliban over the ICOM. They had, of course, situational awareness. It was literally that many of those 20-year-old Western soldiers were basically deaf and blind without having them there. So if you want to attack Western soldiers, you attack the interpreters. So over the years, I've interviewed a lot of interpreters in different countries, as well as veterans, lawyers, resettlement caseworkers, etc. As you can probably hear from the introduction, veterans were a group of people that I had never engaged with before. I was always working on feminist organizations and refugee organizations, and veterans are very much not represented in those communities. So it was a very new group of people I worked with, but they were quite a vocal community when it came to the protection of Afghan interpreters, or vocal. In 2017, 18, and 19, and 20, you basically only had one or two vocal individuals in each country, and they were often extremely isolated. They were absolutely like lone voices, felt really alienated from their experience in the army, and felt betrayed basically by the fact that the people that they'd worked with weren't getting the protection that they thought they deserved. So I was fascinated by this, because these were people who were kind of classical activists in some ways. They had the activist burnout, neglected their family, were hyper-focused on this issue, and I was interested in what drove them. And with some of them, I maintained relationships and built networks. So, of course, there's also the additional kind of background of my personal involvement that continues to today. But just in terms of the structure, so we are here because you were there, I think opens up ways of thinking, at least along 3 different lines, probably more. One, we are here because you were there, of course, signals thinking about entanglements and complicity. Secondly, it makes us think about claims making, you know, claiming rights and protection, claims making and holding somebody to account. And it also helps us think, I think, about solidarity and relationality. There's a relationship between the we and the you that can unfold in productive ways, I think. So, first of all, entanglements and complicity, we're here because you were there, right? This is the kind of very strong causal claim ingrained in the slogan is what makes it partially really powerful. Like, we have not just arrived here in Britain because we felt like it or because we wanted to go to paradise. No, we're here because you waged war in our countries, you colonized our countries, all of those things, right? And we can think of those relationships across different countries, different conflicts, different historical moments. And Ambefalander Sivanandan, he was the director of the Institute for Race Relations. And at the 50th celebration conference, he kind of introduces this again, saying what wasn't said was that it was colonialism that both impoverished us and enriched Britain. So that when after the war, Britain needed all the labor it could lay its hand on for the reconstruction of a war-damaged economy, it turned to the reserves of labor that it had piled up in the colonies. That's why it passed the Nationality Act of 1948, making us colonials British nationals. And equally, when after 1962, it did not need that labor, it brought in a series of restrictive and racist immigration acts. Quite simply, we came to Britain, and not Germany, for instance, because we were occupied by Britain. Colonialism and immigration are part of the same continuum. We are here because we were there. And indeed, I think that notion, right, applies, as I said, across many different communities and different historical moments. The reason I came to Afghan Interpreters was perhaps in a way that some people would consider a detour. I was interested in indigenous communities that had been used as brokers, middlemen, in the past during colonial conquest and in late colonial administration. So some of you know Pocahontas, others know Malinche, who is depicted here interpreting for General Cortes, who was, of course, the kind of leader of the Spanish conquest in Mexico. And these individuals who straddled a very difficult dilemma of, on the one hand, trying to empower their communities, perhaps creating some social mobility for themselves, found themselves often in a moment where they got alienated from their original community, as well as abandoned by the communities that they served, because of course the relationship between colonizers and indigenous communities was one of immense different power relations. And so I was interested in kind of tracing a lineage between Afghan and Iraqi interpreters who were doing that essential work in a neo-imperial war, and kind of tracing that back to those colonial interpreters, brokers, bridges, who had performed that function historically, because I felt that there were very important affinities. So here you see a depiction of Malinche again. You see she's being two-faced, which of course is again that kind of idea of treachery. Some people claim that translation itself is a form of treachery, right? Because you can never be faithful to the original. And this is a quote from one of the interpreters that kind of emphasizes why they're being attacked. So the interpreters thought we are the tongue and the eyes of the British forces. And actually, Malinche was often called the tongue, la lengua, the language, the tongue as well. So, I mean, we're here because you were there, very much, something that also applies to that group. And for instance, people like Pocahontas, they were brought to the UK, right? And they have been paraded around in front of the Queen to show this is the first indigenous person from Virginia who has been Christianized and married to a white man. Here you go. And they covered her in Western clothes. They covered her tribal tattoo so that she looked more Western. Like, people don't know that these stories, but she is also linked to the UK. I mean, she's buried in Gravesend because she never made it back. So also that mobility has always been there. Thank you. Yeah, so indispensable these brokers are, but often very expendable when they're no longer needed, which I think also picks up some of the themes that Camilla introduced around labor and kind of essential labor that is at the same time expendable, where lives are also made expendable, right? Even very tangibly, if you think about the work of Afghan interpreters, British soldiers go on a tour of duty of maximum 6 months. American soldiers 12 months, and you can already see in all the health data that there's a massive disparity in terms of the rate of suicides. For American soldiers, is much higher because of the long-standing exposure during a 12-month tour of duty. For civilian interpreters employed by any of those countries, there's absolutely no time limit. You can be working 3, 4, 5 years. You don't have any military training, but you're sent out on patrol. You can step on the same improvised explosive devices, of course, but also the long-standing exposure to a lot of violence does something with you. And you see here, and I found it quite beautiful, some of the protesting Afghan interpreters make reference to their historical predecessors, right? President Biden, do not turn your back to us. The consequences will be of Vietnam. And here you see on the right, don't repeat the irreparable, the Harkis of Kabul. So the Harkis were Algerians who fought on the French side during the Algerian Independence War. And again, of course, the Harki population Harki community were seen as traitors by the Algerians who wanted independence. The French brought some of them over, housed them in former concentration camps, and didn't treat them very well. So there's also in France this kind of colonial trauma that was played out again with this community. So you could already see the protesters on the previous slide. We are here because you were there, I think also opens up to think about claims making and accountability. We are here because you were there, and it's a kind of unapologetic insistence of being here. We're not gonna ask you for your benevolence. We're not gonna ask you for your compassion. We have a reason to be here. We have a right to be here because of what we did for you and because of what you did to us, right? And I think that's quite important. It shifts the parameters. And even if we think of ourselves as a university of welcome, for instance, we can think about what exactly our position of responsibility is in relation to the people that we host, right? Are we benevolent hosts, compassionate hosts, or are we also owing something to the community that we host because of things we have as a university or as a community being complicit in? So Yeah, you see here some different forms of protest where it's very clear. This is a group of interpreters who worked for the German forces, and they staged a protest that lasted, I think, 14 months, where every week they would go to the main camp in Mazar and stand there. And you can see there's very clever use of symbols. So this is the German flag, of course, the colors. And for those of you who can read German, some of the languages on the right, what we want from you is our rights. We enabled your missions, and that's why you have to protect us. So we're not asking for, as I said, a benevolent gesture of protection. We're demanding our rights. And similarly here, they set up a German local employees union because in Germany the trade union is very important. So they said, okay, then we have a union as well. Really, again, clever use of that symbol. So this was their protest tent. And he now lives in the Netherlands, actually, a guy with the yellow shirt who was the leader of the protest. And here you see an example of social media. A lot of the Afghans did amazing work leveraging Twitter to bring attention to their plight. And I was a social media skeptic, but like a lot of the activist work we did was only possible because of that kind of infrastructure. Never forget those who are loyal in hard times. Again, he doesn't present himself as somebody who has to ask for compassion. He has done something, he has a right to get a certain protection. He's sharing even, so we helped him get a lawyer. It's a very complicated case. Yeah, it's a very complicated case. Basically, 22 Afghan interpreters contacted us who had been accepted by the Ministry of Defense for relocation. They had received a letter. Please sell your belongings, get rid of your car, make yourself ready to move in 2 to 4 weeks. And then in early August, late July and early August 2021, so just 2 weeks before the fall of Kabul, those 22 individuals got a letter from the Home Office that they were not allowed to come to the UK because they were seen as a national security risk. That is quite interesting because these were guys who had security clearance to go on a military base for years. So kind of puzzling. I mean, stunning, right? Like, I mean, unbelievable. Like, I don't know what to say. Anyways, we work with an Afghan barrister in the UK, the only Afghan barrister in the UK, a woman, who we gave all the cases, she farmed them out to law firms. Some of them, 2025, are still ongoing, but we pretty much win all of the cases. I think we have won 18 by now. But the Home Office often, of course, once it comes to the court, they suddenly withdraw the decision, then they're promising to make a new one, etc., etc. But this is his court papers, and and he made it to the UK as well. So what I didn't say from the quote was the first part. The context of the quote is that he starts with saying myths and stereotypes reinforce each other. The common story we tell about why people from the former colonies are here is this one. The myth sets out the story. The stereotype fits the characters. It was said, for instance, that the post-war influx of West Indian and Asian immigrants to this country was due to a push and pull factor. Poverty pushed us out of our countries and prosperity pulled us into Britain. Hence the stereotype that we're lazy, feckless people who are on the make, right? This is the common story. And colonialism and immigration are part of the same continuum. We're here because you're there as a counter story. And of course, Afghan interpreters also have to present their right claims against some of those dominant stories, right? Who is considered deserving of protection? And as migrant Muslim men from Afghanistan, of course, as we know, they have been very much presented in a negative and homogenizing light. They can only be perpetrators of violence, never victims of violence. That's the kind of dominant story that we tell. And so in some of my work, I try to think of claim making as a form of translation, where they have to kind of translate themselves into a legible framework that allows them acceptance. And some of those frameworks that are available to others are not available to them, whereas others are available. So the most common framework, of course, as a refugee is to present as vulnerable. That's the kind of ideal subject story. But as I said, Afghan interpreters tend to be seen as perpetrators rather than victims of violence, as Muslim men who would be a threat to our culture and who would be a threat a physical threat also, because they would be seen as terrorists. And so they find themselves kind of untranslatable when it comes to the discourse of vulnerability, even though they are literally very vulnerable. As I said, they are specific targets for the Taliban. And the UNHCR, the European Asylum Support Office, they all recognize this. And you can see here a quote from Boris Johnson when he started with this kind of boat policy, juxtaposing, right, men under 40 and presenting them as two jumpers who affected Britain's capacity to help genuine women and child refugees. And for all of you who have worked in this space, you know that the women and children is the kind of the quintessential vulnerable category, right? If you don't fall into that, you have a problem. So basically, these claims to protection that they could have access to run along those different lines. Humanitarian discourse, pretty much not available to them. Rights to duties and military service, they have to earn their protection. Basically, they have to say, I already did my duty, now give me my rights, you know, even though we're non-citizens, we did our work for the UK. And then, because they're normally seen as security threats, they have to try to exempt themselves from that very dominant discourse. So they will say, you may think of me as a threat, but I'm not a security threat because my iris scan was taken every day when I came onto the military base. I've been vetted for all of those years. But that, of course, is a very limiting frame. It might help that specific group at that very specific moment, but it doesn't undo the fact that certain migrants are securitized and seen as a security threat. So I'm looking at these different strategies of kind of inserting yourself in a frame, trying to be seen as a vulnerable victim, not quite managing that, subverting existing frames, and exempting yourself. They are often interpolated as a threat, but they try to exempt themselves. No, I'm the one who's screened, who is loyal. I'm not one of those dangerous Muslim terrorists. You know, this is a kind of tightrope walk that they're walking. And again, I mean, I'm sure for all of you who work on Ukrainian communities, Palestinians, you can think of different ways in which this would apply to those communities. So this is an example of subversion. This is a video made at a protest. You know, now we are the forgotten man. We fall outside the British government's latest policy change. Kabul-based interpreters were the first one who supported British forces. Coalition forces said that this will make the country peaceful and stable, but after 19 years, there's no sign of peace and stability. It's a moral obligation of British forces to resettle us. The government at the time only wanted to resettle frontline interpreters, so those who worked in Helmand, not those in Kabul, and they are kind of pushing back against this. The government speaks of frontline areas in its new policy. When the British first came, Kabul was the front line. You guys told us, right? So they're trying to bring this back. The government has promised this. We helped you and saved many lives. Now it's your turn to save our lives. So you can see that they pick up a lot of dominant tropes and kind of try to turn them around. You told us that this country was going to be safe. We look around, it's still not safe. But as I said, of course, there's also risks, especially in the kind of strategy of exemption, as you can see in the Daily Mail quote here, right? It often plays migrants out against each other. You know, we are the deserving because these others are the undeserving. We have been vetted and these others are illegalized and criminals. And you can think of a similar thing, right? We are the women and children. These are the men. So these strategies, I guess we have to be careful with. I'm quite worried about time. I have about 15 minutes only, right? Maybe I show a little bit of the video so that you can hear the voice of the Afghan interpreters. I only have 3 slides, I think, after that. Yeah, maybe just play it.
You also want to use the time.
Yeah, for questions, I agree.
I have some British friends, but I didn't have their address and their names. One of my best friend was the Chibara, which he got killed in a contact, and I bring his dead body from the ground, and it was a very bad day when he got killed. We lost 3 ANA, Afghan National Police, not Afghan National Army, Afghan National Police, and two British, two paratroop, and it was a very horrible situation. They were supposed to leave the dead body of the British force in the ground, but I bring him in my hug, I bring him to the CP bag. Whatever the Taliban watched me by very close, and they fired to me, and they were after that they start to treat me directly on ICAM. And all the paratroopers, they were in Delhi. They heard this why ICAM, the Taliban treat me, and they told me that why we take the dead body of the foreign soldier. It was a very good, a very best thing for us that we can do something on it, and we can have their weapon, and we were going to kill you. And after that, the Taliban started direct fire to me, and I was under the direct threat. And when I bring the dead body to the CP, I only want to send her dead body to her family. That's the only goal that I have, because he was come to Afghanistan to help my people and help me, and I did the only thing which I can do for them. That's the only.
No, not everybody is in the list, but I need to take my family. And then that interpreter said, okay, I will try my best. I will tell the British Army to take all your family with you. And then after we entered that particular building where the British Embassy workers, they were employees, staff, they were sitting there with computer and biometric things, machines. So I entered there, and they asked me for my name and if who is with me in that list. I said it's me, my children, my wife, and but my family is not in the list. If you could please help me with my family. So my mother, she cried and she said, please, we don't have anybody, we will die, we don't like to live here. So she cried a lot, she cried very much. And my sister, she talked to the staff that they can help her. She won't be a burden over the British government. She will work herself out. I mean, she will make money there by herself. She won't be a burden over the government. And they tried their best, but finally that lady, she also cried, and she said that finally she said that I'm not able, because there is nothing written in our documents that I can leave permit other people with this family. So he is only eligible for the Arab scheme, and no one else. So we hugged each other, we cried, and my sisters, my nephew, he was also crying, my mother was yelling, and we had a very bad time. At the end, when we left each other, it was like they are dying and we are going to live, and we are going to heaven and they are going to hell.
Yeah, so finally, so basically it was more like a tangible exhibition, normally exhibited in a space, but we had the opportunity to show it in Newport on a big riverside building and project it outside. And there's a big Afghan community living there. So that's why they made the photo gallery, helped us create this kind of video. This is very much amateur in the sense that for me, primarily, of course, the interviews, I conduct them in the way that I find suitable ethically, and important for the research. So you can hear background noise of children, televisions, of course, in the space. It's not done by any professional sound recorder because this was never the intention. And when I was asked to create a video and provide sound, of course, I also had to go back to the people that I felt most confident would be comfortable with that. So that's also why there are some of those editing decisions. The video tries to also challenge some of the hegemonic frames we have. I mean, as you can see, this is a quote, no other option. If you come close to see, it's hard because especially when you have to go live, once you come as an immigrant, you don't have anything, you have to get used to it because there's no other option. Of course, as we all know, as everybody knows who has any encounter with people who are displaced or who are displaced themselves, many people had a good life in the countries they come from, but often the kind of hegemonic story is that you come to prosperity, as we saw also in the Stephen Nunlin quote. So we try with the quotes also to challenge some of those ideas. So final part, solidarity and relationality. We're now here because you were there for us, or we're still here because you were there for us. In a way, I thought in this particular project, the slogan was also really interesting because some of the veterans who became very vocal advocates for this group, the handful of people who did, also felt we are still here, i.e. we're still alive because you were there for us back in Afghanistan. But equally, of course, there are some people in this video that I know primarily as an activist first before I did the interviews with them, who felt we're now here in the UK because you guys and also the people I work with were there for us. And I think this is the final, I think, opening in terms of thinking that this quote provides to us, right? So we have a kind of spin-off project with the veteran activists, and you can see one of them here that I closely work together with. It just feels so wrong. It feels like we left soldiers behind. And in the longer story, he worked with the Welsh Regiment as well. He says, it feels like we left Corporal Jones from Cardiff behind. And so it's a quite interesting way to break down us and them situations, kind of divisions. You can see some of the collective work they did. And then finally, of course, it helps us, I think across, we are here because we were there, across very specific, as I said, moments in history or very specific conflicts or very specific communities, whether Afghan, whether Sudanese, whether Palestinians, whether Ukrainians. And I only quite recently, when I was writing something up on these billboards, I'd always seen that there was this poster about Ukraine, and I started looking at what it was in Google Image, and I saw that the poster says, Ukraine, there's so much to do. And it was actually also a kind of activist political campaign where they made the posters initially look like travel tourist posters. Ukraine, there's so much to do, but it had the double meaning, of course, there's so much to do. And then when you come closer, you see the destruction that the three main cities depicted here have been subjected to. And instead of inviting you to visit as a tourist, it invites you to donate money to the cause. And so there was some beauty in the fact that actually across Cardiff, our posters always ended up next to each other. So yeah, just also to kind of reach out across everybody's work here in the room. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was extremely rich, and
If you
a
ever
very
want to
nice
visit,
connection to the broader question, so I'm focusing on the specific case. So we started a bit later, so a bit longer, but are any questions?
You can visit the virtual one of the virtual exhibitions still. There's a very long timeline of Anglo-Afghan messing with each other, long imperial history that you can see here.